My name is David Harful, and I'm coming to you today from Black Leadership Analysis to talk to you about the McCone Commission on the Watts Riots. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already and give this video a like. So, the McCone Commission was set up by the governor of California after the Watts Riots. And what he wanted to do was understand what caused the Watts Riots, what societal factors did, and what could be done about it. He also did it to dispel a lot of the misreporting that happened in the chaos of the riots. Now, the commission understood that adverse social conditions could cause riots. However, LA had been rated by the Urban League as the best city for a black man to live. In addition, there were many Mexican people in LA who were also discriminated against, but they never rioted. Many questions surround the 1965 Watts riots. Many still disagree about what happened. However, the McCone Commission report was used as the only source of this video. And because I'm speaking from the government's perspective, I will be using the term riot instead of uprising. So a little background on the history of Watts. Watts is a neighborhood in Los Angeles, California. It was formed from the Tewada land grant. It was famous from its inception because many railroads crossed in Watts, and the land was owned by a family named Watts. Now in 1900, an electric train is built, and a lot of people think that's where Watts got his name, but it's not. It was from the Watts family. Black people and Mexicans moved to Watts to work on those railroads, and that's why there is a large minority population there to this day. So California, its economy grew as a result of both war efforts, but World War II especially. Watts went from a black population of 75,000 to one of 150,000 just in the time of the World War II jobs boom. Black people came up from the South to find jobs and flee racialized terror. Watts wasn't a gym, but it was far from a slum. Most black people in Watts lived in single-family homes, and most were homeowners. The installation of a freeway in 1950 actually allowed for high-income housing to be purchased in West Watts, and that's where most of the black elite lived. So now moving on to the Watts riots. So now let's talk about the Watts riots. So the arrest of a drunk driver sparked the Watts riots, which lasted 6 days in August of 1965. Around 10,000 people participated, most of which were black. It was one of the worst riots in U.S. history. It's $40 million worth of damage, 34 dead, 1,000 injured, and almost 4,000 arrested. People knew that an arrest of a drunk driver actually sparked the riot, but they knew the causes were a lot deeper than that. The black population in Los Angeles grew from 75,000 in 1945 to 650,000 in 1965. Most people were fleeing racial violence in the South and also looking for work. But when they got to LA, they found out they didn't have the right job skills for the market. Most of them had only been agricultural labor, and menial labor was less valued in the 60s because they were moving towards automation. LA had many anti-poverty programs, but most overpromised and under-delivered. Also, housing discrimination law, the Rumford Fair Housing Act, was repealed by popular vote. So that made housing discrimination legal in LA. So essentially the government just abandoned black people yet again. So the riot started from the report of a drunk driver. Someone reported a drunk driver on the highway. White police officer Patrolman Lee W. Minkus comes to arrest him. Marquette Fry was the driver. Marquette failed his sobriety test, was getting arrested. When that happens, normally the car would just be impounded. The passenger in the car was his brother Ronald, and he said he could walk 2 blocks to get the mother to keep the car from being impounded and costing them even more money. Ronald does that, and the mother comes over and scolds them for being drunk and driving. But after a while, a scuffle breaks out between the police and Marquette. Now, as this is happening, a crowd gathers around the arresting officer. It started out as 25 people and grew to 1,000 in less than 25 minutes. At some point in this melee, Marquette's mother actually mounts the back of a policeman to defend her son. All 3 are arrested. Now, the people in the crowd felt like they were manhandling the mother and the sons, so they were getting angry. And one in the crowd spits on an officer. That causes the highway patrolman, to address 2 more people in the crowd. Now, with 5 suspects, they are driving off, and someone throws a stone at a patrolman's car. After that, the riot begins. Cars are stolen, white citizens are beaten, and a police headquarters or control center was menaced. Later that evening, the state highway patrol called LAPD, which is city level law enforcement, for backup. So I want to take a break to go through why did the crowd gather, because often you hear, even with the uprisings and riots today, you hear people, conservatives, saying that why are people trying to defend people who broke the law? So what was going on in this situation is the community wanted to make sure that someone doesn't get abused by the police, someone doesn't suffer from state-sponsored violence. Now, this community had to deal with police abusing them for forever. All these people in the crowd had their own stories of police misconduct, and they have been brutalized themselves. So they wanted to come together in self-defense. Now, this is something that is very normal in the black community, for people to come together to defend each other. And that's partially because we have a more collectivist mindset, being that we come from Africa, and also it's a result of American oppression. If we hadn't banded together, we would have been annihilated a long time ago. Now, you could also say that the crowd should have assumed the patrolman would treat him fairly, and they shouldn't have been assuming something bad would happen. If you take that stance, remember it next time a black man passes you in a hoodie at night. Back to the McCone Commission. The next day, the Human Relations Commission of LA had a meeting at the auditorium at Athens Park. And they got black leaders from all over the city to figure out ways they could quell the violence. Now, according to the commission report, a group of high schoolers stormed the stage and called for violence against white neighborhoods. The media heard this call and then replayed it several times on media, reprinting it in the newspaper, actually making the situation much worse. Now, I was able to find the newsreel from 1965, and that's in a separate playlist on this channel called SD Watts Riot. And what the person actually said was that the conditions they're living in Watts is causing people to be angry and causing them to riot. And eventually the rioting will spill over into white neighborhoods. And they needed to change the discussion from just stopping violence to actually improving the condition in Watts. So the McCone Commission really misrepresented what the man said. So after the large meeting, there was a smaller meeting of gang leaders in Watts. So the commission was asking the gang leaders, like, what did they need to do to stop the violence? And the gang leaders believed that what they should do is have more black cops patrol Watts in South Central. And so the commission brought this idea to the police chief. And the police chief refused to do that because he had already promised other black leaders that he would have black cops in all precincts. Now, this is an interesting difference between on-the-ground black leadership and more elite black leadership. So the elite black leadership wanted the police in all precincts. And what that's going to do is allow for more opportunities for promotion and get white officers used to having black supervisors at lower ranks, which will eventually facilitate there being a black police chief in LA. On the other hand, those on the ground understand that having black officers in Watts is going to reduce the amount of racial violence because you have people there that understand the community. And you have people there that are going to be less prejudiced against the people living there. So that's an interesting dichotomy there in black leadership and a discussion between individualism versus collectivism. So the final stage was the calling of the National Guard. So on August 12th, there were 3 law enforcement agencies involved in calling the Watts riots. We had State Highway Patrol, City Police, and County Sheriff. No one wanted to call the National Guard because if things get out of hand and the Guard kills people, then that's going to look bad on everybody. So LAPD made the first request for backup, some more state level backup, but they never specifically said National Guard. Now at this time, the Governor Brown was in Athens, Greece on vacation, so they couldn't get a hold of him. So the Lieutenant Governor was in charge. So the Lieutenant Governor decided to actually come to Watts to see for himself how bad things were and see if they actually needed guards or not. The LAPD makes their second request and again don't specifically ask for guardsmen. Later on Friday evening, they actually get a hold of the governor and he okays the use of National Guards. Now, the Lieutenant Governor had already stationed guardsmen the day prior in the armory just in case they needed to be deployed. So it wasn't until 10 that night that the guards are actually deployed after 2 blocks of 103rd Street were attacked and burned by rioters. So at 10 p.m., it took 13,000 guardsmen, 900 police, and 700 deputies to quell the violence. And over the coming days, actually bring it to a standstill, and the riot eventually ends on August 17th, 1965. Now we're going to talk about the solutions by the McCone Commission report. The first thing they talked about was the perception of police brutality. The commission framed the conversation around police brutality around the idea that it was perceived. The idea was that over 50% of violent crime in the city was committed by blacks, and they often resisted arrest. So more aggressive police tactics were needed to keep law and order. There was no acknowledgement of actual wrongdoing by the police. Yet they did recognize most of the riots in recent years had started with police incidents. Both police and black citizens must undertake the solution. The police needed to strengthen their police commission. In 1965, the police commission would receive all complaints on police misconduct. And then the supervising officer from that police officer that did the misconduct would do the investigation. So the supervising officer had an incentive to say that nothing bad was happening because it would look bad on him that his officer did something wrong. So what they wanted to do was strengthen the police commission, have it meet more often, have the commissioners get paid more, and also improve their procedures. Instead of having the supervising officer do the investigation, they wanted to appoint an inspector general that would record, and the records from the investigation would be made public so people will know that swift action has been taken. In 1964, they had 412 complaints and only 42 resulted in reprimand. So it's obvious that there needed to be something changed. The commission also recommended there be a community relations board so that every time someone interacts with the police, they are not being arrested or something bad happened. They also wanted to increase the diversity on the force. At the time, only 4% of the officers were black or Mexican, and they needed to increase that number to increase cultural awareness. The commission at the end implores blacks to respect law and order. They have to understand they live in violent neighborhoods and they should expect a heavier and more bellicose police presence. They should remember that the few men of law enforcement are the only thing that stand between us and chaos. The next issue they looked at was employment. So black people in LA face 2 to 3 times the unemployment of whites, and as a result, a higher percentage are on welfare. Now, welfare was created to disproportionately help single-parent-led households. So welfare benefits increase with a single-parent-led household. The original idea was that they needed more help, but the unintended consequences was that many black men left the home. Now, they didn't leave the home because they were irresponsible or just didn't care about their family. They left because at that moment, the best way to get more money into their household was for them to leave. So welfare in California paid $220 a month, whereas minimum wage would pay between $177 to $238 a month. So there's very little incentive to work. On top of welfare driving black men out of the home, it also replaced them as the primary breadwinner, reducing the amount of authority they had in the house. Because they didn't have the authority, because they weren't the main breadwinner, the children would be more likely to be unruly. There would be very little that can be done to stop this, and you end up with a cycle of poverty and abuse that goes on generation to generation that's difficult to remedy. The commission proposed increasing job training programs, and the programs would not only include the job skills such as welding or carpentry, but also soft skills like professionalism. Unions usually opposed these efforts because they saw them as a competition for their apprenticeship program. At the same time they were complaining, they had many discriminatory practices that kept black people out of the unions. So they would complain about something, but they wouldn't try to remedy it themselves. The commission explains that there's an increased number of skilled trade jobs coming in the future, and there's no sense in the unions being worried because there'll be plenty of work to go around. Government jobs were also very important to reduce black unemployment. At the time, 1965, 1 in 4 county employees was black. So it was disproportionately hired black people in the county of LA. The private sector was far more difficult for blacks to enter. So the commission recommended we increase the amount of government jobs and services so we can employ more people. Now, the private sector had been working to remedy a lot of discrimination they're facing themselves. The commission praised the LA Chamber of Commerce for the Rehabilitation Committee that worked to fight for diversity, and they had actually employed 1,200 black people in the private sector. So they wanted to expand that program. They also took into account that many black people face discrimination because of criminal history. Now, the commission wanted employers to look at criminal history with more nuance. Was the nature of the crime violent or not? And also, was there actually a conviction? At the time, simply an arrest was enough to ruin your job prospects. These new job efforts should be led by black people to prevent the same unintended consequences we saw with the welfare system. So the commission proposed that black people lead these new efforts. So, on to education. There was a severe gap in the development between disadvantaged areas in South Central and the rest of the city. 5th graders were scoring in the bottom 18th percentile from South Central, whereas the 8th graders were doing even worse, scoring in the bottom 16th percentile in South Central Los Angeles. Between 8th and 11th grade, you see some of the highest dropout rates in the city. As a result of these dropouts, test scores improve in the 11th grade and they go up to about the 30th percentile. Because of such low test scores and poor performance in school, a large part of South Central was functionally illiterate. Now, they also gave these children IQ tests and they scored low on the IQ test. Now, the commission was clear to say that an IQ test is not testing your inherent ability. It's testing your ability at the time of testing. And they knew that there was a lot of educational disparities between South Central and the rest of the city. So this completely likely that these children have the ability to learn and just have never been given the opportunity. And even at the test scores they were scoring at, they weren't low enough to say that a person couldn't learn to read or couldn't learn the basic skills. So the commission moved on to determine what were the differences in the education of South Central and the rest of Los Angeles. So the commission found that the class sizes are actually about the same at 33 students. However, teachers in disadvantaged areas had around 3 years less experience than other parts of the city. Now, that is because the black areas were actually experiencing large population booms. And because of these booms, they had to hire teachers quickly and then possibly lay them off as the population moved to another area of the city. Also, teachers with more experience want to move to places with top-notch facilities. And so they would leave the inner city schools to go to other places, disadvantaged schools go to other places where they had better facilities. Many of the inner city schools did not have cafeterias because the people there didn't have enough money to give their kids lunch money. And the same goes with libraries and other extracurricular activities. So the commission proposes that they reduce the class size in the disadvantaged areas from 33 to 22. And they're doing that because they understand they're trying to overcome a multi-generational educational deficit. And so those children will need more personal attention than people in other areas of the city. They also propose supplementing school lunches, extracurricular activities, and libraries. And the commission comes to the conclusion that if you understand someone is going through an educational deficit, then you have to give them more resources to overcome it. It's not just simply about equality at that point. It's about giving someone the amount of education and the resources they need to overcome a deficit. Now, as far as consumer relations, the commission did determine that black people pay more for inferior goods. Also, the loans that were accessible in South Central were often predatory. Now, the reason for this is because a lot of people there had low education. They didn't know any better about these loans. And also, they were a very captive consumer market. Most of them didn't have cars, and public transportation was extremely expensive and limited. So, they needed to remedy these problems to make things more equitable. Now, the commission was clear that the predatory business practices weren't because they were black, it was because they were poor. What the commission didn't say was that the reason they were poor was because they're black, and there's many generations of policies that led black people to be poor, but we're not going to get into all that now. They took a look at all the businesses that were looted, and they determined not all the businesses that were looted had predatory practices, and there were some black-owned businesses looted. Now, the solution was more government oversight. They proposed having a civil division of the public defender branch, open a branch in Watts, along with the Better Business Bureau, so people could report predatory business practices. They also implore the Better Business Bureau to give educational classes on how loans work and other consumer products. That way the people in Watts would know how loans work and be less susceptible to predatory business practices. The businesses should also work to change public perception by helping out more in the community, giving to youth programs, charities, and different things like that. Well, that's the McCone Commission. I'm going to be doing summaries on these reports after riots because I feel like we're going to have a lot of civil unrest here in America soon. And I want people to be studied up on what caused it and how we can prevent it from happening in the future and how the government looked at it and what caused all this. Also, you can really draw a straight line from Watts to Donald Trump. So one of the things that was happening in California at this time was the Democratic government, it was a Democratic governor that was in charge at the time of Watts. And so when Reagan runs in the 70s, he uses the failings, what he considers the failings of the Democratic governor to get himself elected. And he gets himself elected on a law and order platform. And so Reagan uses the same law and order platform when he actually runs for president. Now, Donald Trump, Make America Great, is actually a quote from Reagan speech given earlier. And this whole racial dog whistle thing started under Reagan also. So Reagan had a speech in Mississippi in the same town that 3 civil rights leaders died, and he talked about states' rights. So this racial dog whistling started way before Trump. So this whole law and order platform that we're dealing with now from Trump and to some extent Biden, because the Democrats took that law and order platform in the 90s. This all stems back to Watts. So it's important that we fully understand what happened there so we can know what to do in the future. So if you like what you saw, please follow me at blackleaderanalysis.com on WordPress, and also give at sdandrace@gmail.com. You can give through PayPal. Thank you and good night.